Wisconsin's Grover Cleveland in 1893 to be reelected to another term after having first lost re-election. And he's only the second Republican to win, or at least looks like likely to win, the popular vote in 36 years. What does Trump's return to the Oval Office mean for America and for the world? That is our story today. And I can't think of any people better than the three panelists we have today to talk about these issues. Susan Glasser is staff writer of The New Yorker. James Harding is co-founder and editor of Tortoise Media. And Peter Speigel is managing editor of the Financial Times. Good morning, all. Good afternoon, James in London. What a week. A little different than I think we many of us were hoping for, let alone thinking about. But Susan, let's start with you. You already had your analysis out very early in the morning on the 6th about what happened. And so share with us what happened.
Well, thank you, Ivo. It's really J.D. Vance, I guess the new vice president-elect, he called Donald Trump's victory the greatest political comeback in American history, and there's a strong case to be made for that. I think it's remarkable. Remember your January 7th self, whoever you are and wherever you're sitting around the world. My guess is that you had a pretty strong sense that Donald Trump had overreached so wildly with his encouragement of a violent mob ransacking the United States Capitol itself, that was something that was politically impossible to recover from. And you can say in many ways that was perhaps the original sin of the Biden administration, was the failure to conceive of Trump's return as the not only as a serious threat, but as the overriding threat potentially of his administration. There was a really notable quote from the recent Bob Woodward book in which he quoted Biden's first chief of staff, Ron Klain, as saying in that early period in 2021, forget about Donald Trump. He's a sideshow. We're not worried about him. And, look, in politics, as in life, underestimating your enemy comes at great cost. And, because of the other factor, aside from sort of the hubris of, Democrats in not understanding this important fact, you have obviously Joe Biden's decision to run again when he was already over 80 years old and was asking voters to put him back in the Oval Office until he was 86 years old. And he did so in a way that exposed, I think, the hollowness of his own White House, the fact that he had no one around him who could stand up and tell him the truth. Or if they did, history hasn't yet recorded it, and he didn't listen. And so, that exposed, I think, a fatal weakness at the top of the Democratic Party structure. And then, the third factor, obviously, that shaped this outcome was Democratic misreading of the electorate. And that, in the end, convinced just enough voters. I do think I've been reading all the after-action reports. I recommend many of them to you. We can talk about which ones I think are persuasive and which ones aren't. Recriminations are an important way that, Americans talk to themselves, especially Democrats. But I think that there's just no question that the economy powered just enough voters for Donald Trump in key places to persuade independents and Republicans who didn't particularly like him or his brand of MAGA politics to go along with him. And, so where I do dissent from a kind of an emerging conventional wisdom is the idea that this was a landslide for Donald Trump, that this was a massive shift in our electorate. It was a small but mightily important shift in our electorate in a winner-take-all system. And fascinatingly, the math is such that if you changed just about 120,000 votes, the number will change a bit, but about 120,000 votes in three key swing states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, you'd have had a different result. I would also point out, as you're consuming all these articles about what the hell went wrong with the Democratic Party brand, that interestingly, Democratic Senate candidates outperformed Kamala Harris in all 6 of the major swing states. Right now it looks like the Republican won one of those races, but very narrowly. Bob Casey lost in Pennsylvania. But other than that, you had Democratic Senate candidates winning, it appears, in Nevada, Arizona, Michigan, and Wisconsin. 3 of those races, by the way, had women as the candidates. So, it's a more mixed picture than you'll hear. This happens every 4 years in American elections. We overinterpret the results because we have a winner-take-all system. But I do think that it points out dangerous weaknesses that I've perceived for a long time, really going back to the later Obama years, in that Democrats have sort of lost the narrative. They've lost the plot. And I worry going forward that this is going to take a major renewal, that no longer will opposition to Donald Trump be enough to unite and sustain the Democratic coalition. At the same time, I think what I am reading in a lot of these after action reports very dramatically understates the threats posed by the second Trump administration. And I say that based on a clear reading of his record in his first term, paying attention to what he has specifically said he will do in a second term. And in particular, the subject of this show is the world. And I think that we're looking at a fairly radical shift in America's position in the world. I know, Ivo, that you consider this to be, in effect, the end of Pax Americana. I don't disagree with that assessment. I think that, of course, Trump will not do all of the things that he said he's going to do. Even doing a small percentage of them would cause a level of dismay and concern and disruption that people have barely begun to wrap their arms around. I'll stop there.
No, I think I want to get everybody into this, including Peter. You know, ask questions. What I really want to focus on for this segment or this part is sort of the explanation, because Susan's explanation is the Democrats misread the electorate and could have done a better job. The other explanation, just to put him on the table, is that this was actually a vote for Donald Trump. That this was that Trump had an agenda, and that was an agenda that people wanted to take. And the third, which is in some ways more worrisome, the third possibility is it was just throw the bums out. Anti-incumbency is the leitmotif of Western democracy in 2024. I just read somewhere that in the 10 largest elections in 2024, every incumbent lost. I think the only one exception is Mexico. But that may be proven to rule. But in the UK, in France, in India, in Japan just now, in South Africa, throw the bums out, given inflation and given immigration, the 2 issues that were high on the agenda, which suggests it's not a pro-Trump vote, but an anti-Biden/Harris vote.
Yeah, Ivo, I do agree with that anti-incumbent thing, just to be clear. I wanted to sort of give a sense of how to read the Democratic recriminations. But yes, I've always thought the simplest explanation for a problem is usually the explanation. So
I would just say, that was the point I was going to make, and I'm pretty sure you read that in the Financial Times. So that's the only reason why I wanted to chime in there. There's been some analysis. I don't agree with this necessarily, but just take the slight counter to what Susan was saying, is that in some ways, if you were sitting as an incumbent party with the inflation shock that we had over the last 2 or 3 years, obviously it's dissipated over the last 18 months, all the macroeconomic data you had now, that in some ways she actually overperformed expectations, because people with, going into a re-election, if we count Biden's popularity at 35%, the inflation shock that we had, the expectation would be she would have done even worse. So that may be an overly optimistic thing. But that was the point I was going to make, Ivo, and ask Susan about it, which is the extent to which some of this may just be people don't pay attention to what Trump is saying. People don't pay attention to what she is saying. She is identified with the existing administration, and therefore. But Susan, you mentioned one other thing, which I want to just ask you on, which is, you mentioned, that female candidates in the Senate races, have done well. But I got to ask you, to the extent to which, white guy wins, beats Trump in 2020, 2 women lose in 2016 and 2024. It's the inevitable question about whether the American people view women as a presidential timber, and whether that you think to what extent that was the glass ceiling that could not be breached this time.
Yeah, so it's a gut punch, I think, to anyone who cares, about clinging to the shards of, equality in our society at a moment when women's basic freedoms, even to control decisions about their own body, are under assault from one of our two political parties. And then that party ran on an explicitly misogynistic, anti-woman platform. Believe me, I think it would be irresponsible to conclude anything other than that misogyny works. That it works for a significant percentage of the electorate. Was it a decisive factor in Trump's victory? I can't say, because we're still evaluating that. Is it a significant factor in our politics? Absolutely. And Donald Trump and his advisors ran on a campaign that was the most anti-woman campaign I've ever seen, including, as I'm sure you noticed, even down to election day itself, as the polls were closing and they were worried about not winning. What did you see? You saw Steve Miller and Donald Trump Jr. literally tweeting, all men, in all caps, men, go to the polls right now if you haven't already, all men. So, again, they're telling us that to them, this matters, number one. Number two, Donald Trump explicitly used an almost caricaturist version of "I'm a strong man, she's a weak, foolish woman" as his campaign argument, right? His two fundamental critiques of Kamala Harris were she's far too left-wing, she's a crazy Marxist, and number two, she's a woman, weak, foolish, stupid. And, women have been caricatured as weak, foolish, and stupid for centuries. And that includes the centuries of this American experiment. So not only do I not discount it, I'm sure that Trump's self-presentation as a strongman has been a part of his appeal. Now, we're going to have some reckoning to do, because I also believe that Democrats and their supporters in the kind of liberal commentariat are extremely naive and unwilling to look at the data about how much these assumptions about women and gender and leadership affect women voters themselves.
Well, that's what I was going to say, because if you look at the exit polls, the women voted the same this time as they did with Biden. It's amazing.
Day after day for the last month, as I've been warning about Donald Trump's victory, and anyone sadly who knows me knows I've basically been curled up in a ball anticipating this for some weeks. They would tell me essentially, well, you're just a pessimist and I'm counting on the women. I basically almost every single person I knew who held on to the hope that Trump would lose said to me some version of, oh, don't worry, I'm counting on the women. And frankly, I would often say to them, well, the women are no great shakes either. And, I've known this sadly since I was, a kid in the 1980s. And one of the first political things I paid attention to in the early 1980s, again, I don't know, I think I was like a freshman in high school, was the final defeat of the Equal Rights Amendment. This is a country that does not believe women are equal. And so anyways, I will stop. But
no, it's an important set of issues. But James, I want to bring you in here. Get you're observing this from a distance, which is probably good. Particularly since this is visceral and real for all of us, and I think it's visceral and real for you too. Don't want to dismiss that, but love to sort of see what do you make of it and about why this happened.
So, firstly, listening to Susan is really affecting. You just say that is they're just the emotional. I was asking a friend of mine what happens at Thanksgiving when something like this has happened, and trying to understand the dynamics at play, the very personal ones. I think this is going to be something that really weighs on people. Journalistically, I'll say something extremely simple. Serious politics is back. There are three fundamental questions now: capitalism, democracy, and security. And they are the questions that are dominating the way in which we have all driven in 2024 to a politics of rejection, by which I mean capitalism. Does our economy work for people? Democracy, can our politics fix it? And security, who will keep us safe? And these questions, which are so elemental, and I think probably for all four of us, for most of our adult life, there was some level of confidence and optimism in the answer to all of those. That's largely disappeared. And it's an odd thing to think that we had an election in the UK, which on the face of it was almost entirely different to your election, in the sense that the outcome was Keir Starmer, a Labour politician, a politician of the left, won. But in the end, it was the same election. It was an election in which, for all the talk about issues of culture and probity and character, it was an election about inflation, cost of living, and the economy. And the overwhelming outcome, even though the numbers were relatively small in terms of popular vote difference, the overwhelming outcome was a politics of rejection. Let's get the incumbents out and get whoever the new guys are in. And I think that when you look, I think Peter's right, when you look at the inflation numbers, when you look at the wrong track numbers, when you look at the economic anxiety numbers, that was an incredibly hard, possibly, incredibly hard battle to win. And I suppose the one thing I would say about inflation, and I'd sort of, this I park on our as a responsibility of us in the media, Ivo, is I think that for a long time people got lured into this idea that politics is not as much about economics as it used to be. It's about issues of culture. And the reason for that is those stories, those issues, they're all good talkers, right? Everyone wants to weigh in on some of those issues, and immigration and abortion within that context. Inflation is a story that grinds away at people. And although the Fed might think the numbers look a little better, that's not what people feel. And certainly not what people feel, I think, in the bulk of kind of working America and certainly working UK. So I think that's the real issue. And the worry you've got to have is that if you really think that there's a problem with the extent to which capitalism is working for a sufficient number of people, do you think that either party, either, tariffs, taxes, China is the way of addressing it? Or does the Democrat Party even have a coherent strategy? Right. And I think that's the most worrying thing in some ways, which is the American people have spoken for a lot of people in the world. It's not working, but neither party really seems to have a recipe to return a sense of prosperity and promise.
James, can I just ask James on that one? Because I know, because James and I talked about this ad nauseum several years ago when he was setting up Tortoise. I mean, in many ways, your vision for it, if I'm not mistaken, was there needs to be a place where, for lack of a better word, the radical center has a conversation about how to fix these problems, because we're going in a place at the time, Jeremy Corbyn on the 1970s, socialism on the left, and in some ways 1930s, far right in the U.S. and Hungary and elsewhere. Where is the center? Where is the center having the conversation of how to fix these things? And I'm just curious, now that you're several years into your project here, do you see any municipalities or governments or anywhere in the center who have come up with cogent policy platforms from the center where we're supposed to be able to address these economic issues that you've rightfully pointed out as at the core of discontent?
So I think that there's obviously east, west, north, south, massive, disparities in that. I think that a coherent argument around investment, where do you use the power of public investment coupled with the crowding in of private investment, ends up being the question. Now, I actually think one of the kind of sadnesses of this week is that a really interesting set of policies, the Inflation Reduction Act, which has driven growth, not distributed necessarily the way in which many Americans would think is right, not necessarily dealing with the inflation problem as promised, but fundamentally a step-change investment in the economic trajectory of the country. There's a lot to be said for that. I mean, one thing I was just going to come to, I'll just come to it if I might now, Ivo, is there's a story that is not nearly as interesting as the US presidential election, but within Europe, is as much of a canary in a coal mine, which is Germany. Right. While the United States was counting its votes, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz was firing the finance minister, collapsing his government. The country is flat on its back. Germany, the most important economy in Europe, for years the model of what kind of globalization for an industrial modern nation would look like, is a total mess. And by the way, about to get worse, because tariffs make life more difficult. The fight with China over electric vehicles makes life more difficult. I mean, this was your bread and butter, Peter, when you're in Brussels. I think Europe is in a deep, deep mess. And it's a weird story because it's a bit like inflation in the United States. It's a really crunchy economic story.
Yeah, no, I think, James, it's very smart. I think, but just the point you made to start off with, that we're back to big politics, capitalism, democracy, and security, I think is absolutely correct. I think people have missed, and by the way, Trump did not miss this. He got it exactly right. Inflation isn't a question of what the change is from one year to the next. It's the accumulated change in prices, and it's a 25% increase. If you are an American, you're paying 25% more for your groceries than you did 3 years ago. And that's inflation. Inflation isn't whether it's 2% or 4% or whatever. That's all a bunch of nonsense. And the Biden folks never spoke to that. And Trump did, and he was right on that. But Peter, I sort of put you on the spot here to start thinking about, okay, so what can we expect? In some ways, Trump did run on the issue of, I can make you prosperous. I can deal with the threats to democracy as he defined them, and I can make you safe. So as you look ahead, what do you take of his agenda in terms of the economic agenda? Is that going to work? And is it going to provide the answers that Americans, and indeed, I think all Westerners, we saw it in Japan too, by the way, all Westerners are looking for this story. How do you get back to the kind of growth that we used to have, the kind of vibrant democracy where we believe that politics could solve problems? And I agree with James that the IRA, in other words, starts that process, but it's not enough. And then make us secure, because the world certainly doesn't feel secure.
Oh God, Ivo, this is the toughest question to answer, to be honest with you. I mean, look, I have the same answers largely that I think most of sort of the commentariat has on this one, particularly in the economic, but also on the security front, which is, I don't know any economist in the world who thinks that a system of elevated tariffs somehow is going to produce a new manufacturing era in the United States. It just doesn't make any sense in any textbook way of that we understand global economics. And actually, people seem to forget that if you put up tariffs, there are other actors in the process that they will put up tariffs, and suddenly you have a 1930s era tariff war. Now, the one caveat I have heard on this, which is I don't find convincing, but I think it's worth putting out there, is everyone does make the comparison to the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act of 1920, whatever it was, that the sort of is seen as a major contributing factor to the Great Depression. The difference now is back then the U.S. was China. Right, we were the low-cost manufacturing hub for the world. We were an exporting nation, and now we are the importing nation, and we're the customer. And so we may have different impacts on the global economy because of that. But I don't see, and I don't know anyone. I mean, there are a lot of people smarter than I am who have written about this. I don't see anyone thinking that somehow that the tariffs are somehow going to lead to a manufacturing renaissance in the U.S. Security-wise, if you want me to focus more on that, because I think this is something that this show in particular focuses on, I am incredibly worried.
Before you go, James wants to just jump in.
One thing about I completely agree with you on tariffs, and I don't want to make Susan feel worse than she already is. One thing I think that is coming, I'm sad to say, Washington's way, is corruption. I think you cannot have a system where a government is likely to make such a material impact on the future of different businesses without a flood of big money lobbying. I spoke to a friend of mine in DC, and she was saying the real winners here are real estate agents, right? Because money is coming to town. Peter Thiel wants to buy a place here. Elon may want to buy a place there. But when you actually think it through, business is coming to town because it thinks that it now has a government which will actively tilt the playing field in its favor if it lobbies effectively. That is, I think, actually a really big issue, because the relationship between corruption, not just in the United States, but around the world, and autocracy, and Applebaum has written brilliantly about this, I think this is an issue. And for those of us who look to Washington and look to the US model as something that is kind of, city on the hill, kind of principal example of what democracy can be, this is something to worry about.
So I want to bring Susan in there, because Susan wrote a really absolutely brilliant New Yorker piece on the billionaires behind it, and the billionaires won. And it is a big, so just to the corruption point. But Susan.
Yeah, I'm glad that, these comments are really important by both Peter and James, because here's the thing. It's caricatured and often mistaken. And, I understand that, like, they're just, personal greed, or they want their tax cuts. And what I learned in spending, months trying to talk to these Republicans, by and large, business establishment type Republicans, who were nonetheless, endorsing Trump and giving him millions and millions of dollars, despite their personal distaste for him. The reason was exactly this. It wasn't corporate tax rates. It was, they understood the transactional, highly corrupt nature of Donald Trump very clearly. There are no illusions there. These folks on a personal level are wealthier than ever before, thanks to the Biden years. So, I'm sure they are greedy enough to want to have more on their bottom line. What they really want is deregulation and, if possible, even complete control over the regulatory space in their own particular line of business. That's something that Donald Trump has put on offer. In fact, it was an underappreciated aspect of his first term in office. And I recounted some of the stories that never, were the kind of major note in people's understanding of the first Trump term. But I bet, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the story of how Donald Trump outsourced control over the Veterans Administration to the Marvel Comics billionaire who was his friend from Mar-a-Lago, who literally became the shadow boss of the VA. And to me, that is the prototype for something that will now become much more systemic across government. And even remarkably, that Marvel Comics billionaire, Ike Perlmutter, who is a personal friend of Trump's from Mar-a-Lago, who gave millions more to his campaign this year, the Wall Street Journal reported that was explicitly the template and the model for the kind of role in government that Donald Trump wants to give to Elon Musk, and that they discussed explicitly this year. And Musk, by the way, of course, has much more grandiose ambitions than Ike Perlmutter did. And instead of just the VA, we were talking about the wealthiest man in the world, feeling that essentially he is a majority stockholder in, the Trump presidency. And at the Madison Square Garden rally, which I did attend, and, absolutely correctly portrayed as a 5-hour-long festival of hate speech.
Did we lose Susan there?
I think we lost Susan.
Ivo, can I just jump on here, because Susan's piece,
and I also want to mention that to the Musk point, today's front page of the FT, the big photograph has the entire family. We lost you, Susan. It has the entire family. And Musk,
Elon Musk with the family,
which is just stunning as an example to what Susan is going to say. This is a wholly owned subsidiary of both the Elon Musk empire and the Trump family.
So if I can just make 2 points on what Susan said, because I thought her piece was brilliant too, also because it cited the FT in it. But
as it should. You guys have done good work. It's not appreciated, I think, fully in Washington, frankly.
So the one thing I will say, because I don't think, well, let me say this. I believe this, and I think it's worth saying, that not all Republicans who advocate for deregulation are corrupt. And I think we need to say this, because there is a certain extent, I also had, because of exactly what Susan was talking about, told our reporters to be going out there and talking to business leaders about this. And Susan's 100% right. It is not, this caricature of I want tax cuts is wrong. But I think some of the blame has to go on the Biden administration. This has been the most anti-business Democratic administration in my lifetime. Bill Clinton, Barack Obama would at least allow businesses into the White House to talk about their concerns, their issues. Lena Khan, Gary Gensler. I mean, the man went on the picket line with the UAW. Now, we may all agree in one way or the other with the positions that Biden took. But if you are a business leader and you see the president of the United States stand up on a regular basis and say, I want to bust up your businesses, you're all a bunch of corrupt, I support labor, what am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to do? I hate Donald Trump, but I got to back him because this guy says I'm an idiot. Now, that all said, the other point that Susan made, which I think is really important to say, is that Donald Trump is not a run-of-the-mill pro-business Republican. He is a grifter, right? And so the people who are showing up, and this gets to James' point about the corruption, the people who are showing up in Washington are not your run-of-the-mill Rockefeller Republicans from the Northeast. They are people who see a grift and they want to get on it. And what worries me about that, having spent time, particularly in the developing world, but also, I don't want to insult anyone on this call, on this show, watching this show, but I have a lot of friends from Southern Europe, and particularly Italy, who have been forced to leave Italy because of the corrupt nature of their society. What happens is, in a democracy that is corrupt and full of graft, is good people leave the government and more grafters get in, and it becomes a self-licking ice cream cone. So if you are Italian, why are there so many Italians in London? Why are there so many Italians in Brussels? Why are there so many Italians working for the Financial Times? They feel they have to get out of Italy because that government has become so corrupt. You sell your soul to get a job in the bureaucracy. And that is what slowly undermines democracies worldwide. And that is, I fear, the direction we are going with Trump. It's not run-of-the-mill Republican deregulation. It is graft. It is graft, and that is Trumpism. I mean, the people he went in bed with on crypto, who the hell are these guys? They're not even mainstream crypto guys. James, I'm sorry, you keep wanting to jump in here.
No, I just want to say one thing, Peter, which I think is important. I think you're really right to point out, the sense of hostility that businesses felt from the Biden administration. I think that's right. I think it's also really important not to caricature the people who voted for Trump as wanting some corrupt system. What I was trying to say was, when so much is at stake for businesses as a result of changes to tariff policy or tax policy or, regulatory policy, I mean, just begin to think about what's going to happen in health, what's going to happen in energy, you have to send someone to Washington, right? You're not basically fulfilling your fiduciary responsibility to your shareholders if you don't send the best person and proper muscle to Washington to fight for your interests. And the reality is that when there is so much at stake, competing businesses will seek to get the best possible legislative or regulatory treatment. That normalizes lobbying, as you say, and it easily tips, in some cases, not all, but it too easily tips into corruption. And my worry is that the real issue here, as someone living in Europe, is that what tends to happen in US politics echoes across the rest of the world. So the logical thing, to pick up on the point that Susan made to begin with, which is the polarization of gender along political lines, liberal and conservative, and the point you're making around corruption and regulation, this will come to Europe too, not least because the response to the tariffs is we need sovereign autonomy. We need to make sure, strategic autonomy, we need to make sure that our economy is completely self-serving in the way in which the US is going to do. And again, you're going to see even more people going to Brussels. So I think the ripples are big ones.
So I think that's, I want to jump in the last 10 minutes to talk a little bit about security piece and the foreign policy piece, because after all, that's what we're here for. Although this has been a fascinating discussion, just to re-emphasize Peter's point on business not having a voice in the Biden administration, the one person who understood that best was Kamala Harris, who went out for the last 107 days and explicitly tried to bring in the business community, including through Tony West, her brother-in-law, engaging with and mentioning the word capitalism probably more than the word abortion, and certainly more than Joe Biden ever did in the 4 years he's been in office. But James, let me come to you on sort of the foreign policy and security implications, which is a big deal. You've mentioned already part of it, which is the American example to the rest of the world, not the shining city on the hill, but the decaying issue of potential corruption at massive scale and a democracy writ large. But there is more to it.
Can I give you sort of three little stories? And they're not little, but stories that give you a sense of what it's like to be on this side of the world thinking what's going to happen on your side of the world. There are 10,000 North Koreans on effectively European soil fighting for Vladimir Putin in his war against Ukraine. The Spanish king went to Valencia on the back of storms in which hundreds of people were killed, and the anger towards that king and the prime minister too. They were throwing mud at him. It was a sort of politicization of, you might call it a freak storm. Most people would say the consequences of climate change. And then a really small thing, they're just beginning to organize the next AI summit coming in Paris, the next AI safety summit. The themes are sustainability and I think gender inclusion. And they're suddenly thinking to themselves, Macron's team is thinking, we've got a problem here. It's 3 weeks after the inauguration, and the president of the United States is not really interested in those things, right? So, you know, the piece that you wrote for Politico, Ivo, about Pax Americana, everyone is trying to work out, hang on, what does that actually mean? You know, Susan, you know what the White House and the State Department does next, but they're really trying to work out, is he really coming to do a deal, which is Putin gets to keep 20% of Ukraine? Is that really the deal? Climate, is it really the end of COP and that process? And on AI, the biggest technology revolution of our lifetimes, is it essentially each continental economy for themselves?
Yeah, those AI is going to be dictated by Elon Musk, who's now clearly, you know, got the ear of the president.
Yeah, and that's and deregulation. And AI, so AI is already growing without governance, and that's only going to continue. Susan, jump in. A lot of things.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So on security, I think you're right. My expectation. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Breaking
on
up
security, my expectation is that this is going to be a potentially a very crisis-driven presidency with lots of crises, far more than in the first Trump term, when I think leaders were waiting him out. They were assessing that the risks of his uncertainty around him. They didn't want to poke the bear if they didn't have to, especially if he was going to turn out to be an aberration, and American foreign policy would follow the same course. I think they will now have concluded, no, this is a pretty decisive shift, and that Americans' foreign policy, and that means they will begin to take more concrete actions, first of all. Second of all, it's a more dangerous world than it was just 4 years ago. And the acceleration in the relations and ties among Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, they're just simply at a different place. And so, we have to expect far more testing. And, by the way, one obvious potential consequence of Trump forcing Ukraine or trying to force Ukraine into a deal on Russia's terms is that leaves Russia able to make trouble somewhere else. I think my view is that NATO Article 5 is already a dead letter as we're speaking, because it is really based on, the word of the participants. It doesn't require a formal exit from NATO to kill it. So that's my basic view, and I want to know what you say.
James is about to lose it over there.
About to jump out of the.
Can we just park the bus? I mean, just listen to what Susan said.
Yeah.
That's incredible. I mean,
I have to agree with it. I think in a very fundamental way, what we have missed in this argument, and we missed it in the first term. The moment you change, you start thinking about the value of alliances in monetary transactional terms. You dismiss the value that alliances provide for your own security. And
this is not just a European thing, right? This is
for the Japanese and the Australians, and the South Korea,
yeah,
and the Philippines.
South Korea and Japan are in big trouble, in my view.
So just take the
Security.
most obvious place, immediate case that is not in Europe, which is the Philippines. The Philippines has for the last 8 months been trying to actively resist the encroachment of China's Coast Guard on its territory, on the islands and shoals in the South China Sea that China is claiming as its own. And the United States has backed them up. In fact, the U.S. has tried to be even more aggressive and said, we will help you, we will be there. That's not going to happen anymore. And so the Philippines will have to accommodate China. And the reality is, if you can't balance, you bandwagon, as the literature has it. And the same is going to be true in Europe has an option. Europe has the option to say, listen, 80 years after the end of World War II, we probably do have the economic wherewithal to have a serious defense that is capable of resisting a Russia with an economy that is, smaller than Italy's. But the idea that the United States is the last vestige of of security commitments to Europe is one that I don't think a European can take seriously.
No, and I got to say, I was getting text messages from my old Brussels sources, in the next morning, and the problem, as James pointed out, is at least you had Germany, now you don't. France is a mess. So my Brussels sources, the German-French axis is completely dysfunctional now. Where else are you looking? Maloney? I mean, there's no one else in Europe to be able to stand up and say we need to galvanize ourselves. Well, the only other thing is we're running out of time. I think we'd be really miss a chance to talk about the biggest hot war going on right now next to Ukraine. Is obviously the Middle East, and I can't for the life of me figure out why those who believe that the U.S. has to be, however you want to phrase it, a bit more tougher with Netanyahu, somehow thinks that Donald Trump is the answer to that. Because this is, to me, in many ways, the most frightening result of this is he is going to give Netanyahu free rein. We are going back to maximum pressure on Iran in a shooting war. I mean, to Susan's point, I think is really important. I think we forget the first 2 years of the Trump administration, pre-pandemic. I remember all my Democratic friends saying, well, at least there's not a crisis, right? He can't really screw things up because there's nothing really going on. Now there's two hot wars going on. And I do think in many ways the Middle East is more dangerous because there will not be the instinct to try to separate the sides and try to play shuttle diplomacy. There will be a one-sided, not only on the Israelis, but on the Gulfies, anti-Iranian policy, which in the middle of a shooting war is going to escalate things. And we could have a proper ground war or missile war in the Middle East happen within the next 18 months, I think. And that, to me, is actually the more dangerous place right now than Ukraine.
Yeah, I think that's right, Peter. And I think Netanyahu was banking, his entire strategy is banked on Trump winning,
and the Saudis as well.
Well, the Saudis were debating it, I think, in some ways, but they're fine with this. The problem is that Netanyahu, after the success with regard to Hezbollah and what he has shown he is able to do against Iran, is going to suffer from the same problem they always suffer from, saying, "Wait a minute, why don't we just go after the head of the snake?" And the head of the snake is the nuclear program in Iran and the regime, and it's going to pose a fundamental challenge to Trump. On the one hand, I think he would love to be the president who ended Iran's theological regime and its nuclear program. And on the other hand, we have seen in the last 4 years that this is not a guy who likes to use force. He doesn't like to take risk.
I mean, he did missile and kill the head of the Quds Force when he was
yeah, but that was the kind of targeted thing, which is kind of looks cool. But remember, when the Iranians went after the oil refinery in Saudi Arabia, we did nothing. And when we needed to strike Iran, he said no. So I mean, there is this tension between the strong man showing how strong he is and the reality that he doesn't like to use force. And in this world, anybody can exploit that. And Netanyahu is a master of it. And in some ways, so are others. Well, this has been a very uplifting discussion. But I think it has been incredibly insightful. And
it's also been a good therapy session, I think, for the three of us. We appreciate it, Ivo. Yeah.
I do feel like this is you're convening us just to talk, which is really helpful to me. By the way, I do appreciate it.
Well, and a lot of insights on issues like corruption and just a lot of other issues, including what to expect, and that's what we try to do. One, we try to be therapists for each other, and two, we try to be therapists for our listeners, and we succeeded, and that's why I couldn't have thought of three better people to do this with this morning than Susan Glasser of the New Yorker, James Harding of Tortoise Media, and Peter Speigel of the Financial Times. And thank you all for joining us today. We'll be back next week with another uplifting conversation on the world in review. Until then, have a great weekend.